More than 300 South Korean nationals detained in a U.S. immigration raid are now back home. They were detained during an ICE raid at a plant under construction in the state of Georgia. It was being built as a joint venture between South Korean giants LG Energy Solution and Hyundai. It began with images that stunned both South Korea and the United States. Over 300 South Korean engineers and technicians flown in to help build a state-of-the-art Hyundai and LG battery plant in Georgia were suddenly placed in handcuffs. ICE agents arrived with helicopters and armored vehicles, pointed guns and detained workers who had no idea why they were being treated as criminals. These were not undocumented workers. They were skilled specialists brought in under short-term visas to launch one of the largest foreign investments in America. The sight of them returning home to Seoul with plastic bags carrying their belongings struck a nerve. What should have been a story of cooperation became a symbol of distrust. The raid triggered an outcry from South Korea, a key U.S. ally, and raised questions about foreign investment in the U.S. The Trump administration has spent months building a reputation for toughness. Reciprocal tariffs of 10 to 50% have been rolled out. A 100% tariff on imported semiconductors has been announced with exemptions only for companies that commit major investment in the United States. In that climate, the Georgia raid was meant to send another signal that America would control its borders on its own terms. But the consequences went far beyond immigration enforcement. South Korean companies immediately questioned whether the United States is a safe place to expand. Conservative newspapers in Seoul, usually supportive of the U.S. alliance, openly warned that investment plans could be reconsidered. Families of the detained engineers watched their loved ones return home in tears. In a country where corporate reputation is tied to national pride, the perception that elite workers were chained and mocked by guards was devastating. What was intended as a show of strength quickly turned into a warning sign for global investors. Faced with outrage, Washington tried to contain the fallout. A senior State Department official was sent to Seoul to express regret. President Trump himself posted a message saying foreign companies were welcome and their workers would be allowed to train Americans. Yet his words raised more questions than they solved. He spoke about letting Korean experts teach American workers, then phasing them out. To many in South Korea, this sounded less like an apology, and more like a declaration that their people were disposable. The damage was already clear. Public protests in Seoul displayed banners asking whether America was still a friend. Social media in Korea filled with calls for lawsuits against the U.S. government, and demands that LG and Hyundai stand firm. Some voices even urged reciprocal measures against Americans working in Korea. Instead of reassuring one of its closest allies, the administration had created a storm of resentment. In diplomacy, words matter, but so do actions, and the actions in Georgia cut deeper than any tweet could repair. The Georgia incident is more than an isolated raid. It highlights the contradiction at the heart of current U.S. policy. Washington is demanding that allies like South Korea commit hundreds of billions of dollars in new investments to qualify for tariff caps. At the same time, it is allowing immigration crackdowns that humiliate the very workers needed to make those projects succeed. For South Korea, which already pledged a $350 billion investment package, the raid exposed the risks of relying too heavily on the U.S. market. For America, it risked undermining the credibility of the promise that the country is open for business. In global supply chains, confidence is as important as capital. Once lost, it cannot be restored easily. The message from Georgia is clear. A policy built on pressure and unpredictability can just as easily backfire. Instead of attracting investment, it can drive it away. Instead of strengthening alliances, it can weaken them. The handcuffs and chains placed on engineers in Georgia may be remembered not as a triumph of enforcement, but as a turning point when America's strategy pushed an ally to question its trust. Don't push a Canadian too far. Haven't been pushed too far, pushed too far, pushed too far by someone who's richer, someone who's more powerful, maybe a little more arrogant. I don't know. I can't think of an analogy. At the Toronto International Film Festival this year, the spotlight was not only on cinema, it was also on Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney. In a tribute speech, he recalled how Canadian actor John Candy often played characters who were pushed too far, who eventually stood up for themselves. Carney then added his own twist. He reminded the audience that Canadians too will not sit quietly when their sovereignty is challenged. On the surface, it was a celebration of film, but underneath it carried a pointed message. At a cultural festival known for its global reach, Carney sent a signal to Washington. Canada, he implied, will not be intimidated by Donald Trump's pressure. Using the language of film and humor, Carney transformed an art stage into a platform for political resistance. The timing of this remark matters. Only days earlier, the United States had raised tariffs on Canadian goods outside the USMCA framework from 25 to 35%. These measures, announced on August 1st under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, struck industries like softwood, lumber, steel, and aluminum. Trump called them reciprocal tariffs. For Canadian producers, they were a direct threat to their livelihoods. In this climate, Carney's line about being pushed too far was not entertainment. It was a response to escalating trade aggression. The Prime Minister had already introduced an $80 million regional tariff response initiative for small and medium-sized businesses in Atlantic Canada, helping them invest in new markets and storage systems to reach Europe and Asia. His government framed this as part of a broader plan to give companies the tools to adapt rather than wait for uncertain outcomes. By placing humor and resilience side by side with practical support, Carney sent a clear message. Canada would not bow to Trump's tariffs, but would act with both defiance and preparation. That same week in Ontario, Carney expanded on this theme. He described the global trading system as experiencing not a transition, but a rupture. According to him, the United States had moved away from decades of free trade and returned to economic nationalism with tariff rates at their highest since the Great Depression of the 1930s. These are not small adjustments. Supply chains built over generations are now being disrupted. Companies are holding back investment, and workers in multiple sectors are facing new uncertainty. Carney argued that Canada cannot afford to rely on one partner, even if that partner is the United States. His government announced a major projects office to fast-track infrastructure and energy projects, while reinforcing a Buy Canadian strategy to keep domestic demand strong. The purpose was not only to defend against U.S. tariffs, but also to reorient Canada toward a wider network of allies in Europe and Asia. Taken together, these steps underline a national strategy that goes beyond symbolic gestures. Carney's TIF remarks were a cultural prelude to a comprehensive economic plan.
We're in a more dangerous, divided, and intolerant world. In Canada, our sovereignty, our identity has come under threat. And when Canadians heard those threats, they channeled their inner John Candy. Hope is not a strategy. It's time, as I said earlier, to control what we can control, the products we buy in Canada. Taking the time so our businesses can have what they need to adjust to new realities.
This contrast with Donald Trump could not be sharper. In Washington, tariffs have become the hallmark of economic policy. By early August, global rates on over 60 countries ranged from 10 to 50%, with Trump even threatening 100% duties on semiconductors. The White House defended these as necessary to bring jobs home. But independent studies, including those from U.S. universities like Yale, have warned of rising household costs. In Ottawa, the response has been different. Carney's approach ties national pride with economic resilience. His choice of words at TIFF and his policy speeches afterward both reflect the same theme. Canada will defend its sovereignty by diversifying, investing, and standing together. What began as a tribute to an actor became a declaration of strategy. For Canadians, the message was unmistakable. Their Prime Minister used humor to mask steel, turning a festival of stories into a reminder that Canada is ready to write its own.
We've taken in trillions of dollars, and by the way, all these countries signed agreements as an example. They signed, they're all happy, everybody's happy.
New this morning, President Trump's efforts to reshape the nation's trade policy have taken a hit after a federal appeals court ruled that most of his sweeping global tariffs are unlawful.
In early September 2025, President Donald Trump continues to defend the tariffs that have defined his second term. He insists they are the cornerstone of America's economic strength, arguing that without them, the United States could slip into decline. Yet those same tariffs now face their most serious challenge. A federal appeals court ruled at the end of August that most of the global duties imposed under emergency powers are unlawful. The decision is stayed until October 14th, giving the administration time to appeal to the Supreme Court. For Trump, this is more than a legal dispute. He ties the survival of his economic model to tariffs, portraying them as protection for trillions of dollars in new investment, especially in artificial intelligence. But while the president speaks of national survival, financial markets and ordinary households are bearing the real cost. Meanwhile, across the northern border, Canada is watching and preparing measures to shield its domestic market.
President Trump is touting what could be a financial windfall for the United States, but at whose expense is it? American consumers. We've been talking to small business leaders about how the tariffs are affecting them. Most of them say that they are currently eating the tariffs, but eventually are going to have to pass on the cost to their consumers.
Support for tariffs has collapsed. A majority that once backed Trump's policy has shifted, and 6 in 10 Americans now oppose it because prices continue to rise. Importers confirm the squeeze. Companies like Fontana Forna USA faced duties near 80% on containers of Italian goods and were forced to raise prices by 10% this summer. Economists are clear. Tariffs are paid by U.S. firms at the port and passed directly to consumers. The promise that foreign producers would absorb the cost has not materialized. Canada, on the other side of the border, is charting its own course.
Relief for consumers at the grocery store and other small businesses may be on the way. Ottawa has dropped a number of tariffs on U.S. products covered by the CUSMA Free Trade Agreement.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's government announced in late August that it would drop most retaliatory duties on U.S. goods covered by USMCA. At first, this looked like a concession. Yet it was a calculated move to ease pressure on households while keeping leverage in negotiations. Everyday grocery items such as coffee, tea, nuts, and pasta had carried a 25% surcharge. With that barrier gone, Canadian consumers are expected to see gradual price relief as new shipments arrive. Retailers caution that it will take time because existing stock was imported under the old tariffs, but the difference at customs is significant. Food inflation in Canada was running at 3.4%, 4% year-over-year in July, compared with a normal range of 1.5 to 2.5%. Reducing counter tariffs is meant to move that rate closer to stability. Businesses also note that U.S.-made furniture and other imports will become more affordable, giving consumers breathing room. The contrast between Washington and Ottawa is now impossible to ignore. Trump has doubled down on tariffs as symbols of power even as courts question their legality and polls show a public backlash. Prices for groceries, cars, and household goods keep climbing, leaving many Americans frustrated. Carney, by contrast, has moved quietly but decisively to reduce tariffs that were no longer serving Canadian interests. By lowering costs at the checkout counter, he is reinforcing consumer confidence while keeping channels of dialogue with Washington open. This is not a weakness. It is a strategy that turns selective concessions into domestic gains. Where Trump's approach is producing political headaches and economic uncertainty, Canada is showing how pragmatic adjustments can strengthen the home front and protect long-term negotiating power. The central message is clear. Tariffs may have been launched as a show of strength, but in practice, they are straining American households. Canada's decision to lower its own duties demonstrates that resilience comes not from clinging to a failing policy, but from adapting it to serve the needs of citizens.
There's likely to be a fourfold increase in the demand for critical metals and minerals over the course of the next decade. So we're creating a rare earth magnet supply chain between Quebec, between Canada, and Germany.
There is no doubt anymore Trump's tariffs have pushed America's closest neighbor, Canada, to turn toward Europe. When Donald Trump slapped a 35% tariff on Canadian exports outside CUSMA this August, the expectation was clear. Canada would bend. Instead, Mark Carney flipped the script. He scaled back some counter tariffs while keeping steel, aluminum, and autos protected, signaling that Canada would not give away its leverage. That shift opened the door to something larger. Rather than fight Washington blow for blow, Ottawa turned to Europe, using its vast reserves of copper, lithium, and rare earth minerals to build new alliances. What began as a tariff assault quickly evolved into a story of how Canada could outplay Trump by turning resources into power.
Now, Germany has been amongst the leaders in beginning that diversification, away from China, particularly China, and Russia. Canada can play a role in accelerating that diversification, for Germany and for Europe.
That strategy came into focus during Carney's European tour this August. His stops included Berlin, Warsaw, and Riga, but the most important outcome came in Germany. Canada and Germany issued a joint declaration to deepen cooperation on critical minerals, the raw materials that power everything from electric vehicles to wind turbines. Under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, Canada already had preferential access to the European Union market. Carney used that framework to accelerate new projects in copper, lithium, and rare earths. For Germany, the timing was critical. Since cutting energy ties with Russia, Berlin has been searching for secure supply chains. For Canada, the partnership provided not only an economic outlet, but also a political counterbalance to Trump's tariffs. Instead of depending solely on the US market, Canada was locking in opportunities across the Atlantic with Europe's largest economy as a new anchor. What turned headlines into substance were the deals signed on the ground. In Berlin, Carney announced that Troy Gold, a Canadian mining company, secured a long-term copper supply contract with Erebus H, a German smelting and recycling group. In Quebec, Tornit Metals entered into an agreement with VAC, one of the global leaders in rare earth magnets. This created a direct Canada-Germany supply chain for magnets essential to clean energy and defense industries. At the same time, Rocktech Lithium, a Canadian-German company, advanced a new lithium arrangement to support Europe's decarbonization plans. These transactions showed that Canada was not just making declarations, but building the physical trade flows that could sustain a rare earth alliance. Industry experts note that global demand for critical minerals is expected to quadruple by 2035, according to the International Energy Agency. By acting early, Canada positioned itself as a secure supplier for Europe at a moment when the United States was driving uncertainty with new tariffs. What Trump used as a blunt instrument, Ottawa turned into leverage.
Donald Trump helped us get here. A lesson that our partners to the south, the Americans, have learned about the vulnerabilities in the rare earth magnet supply chain, and so we need to move quickly.
The contrast could not be clearer. Trump relies on tariffs that disrupt trade and rattle markets. Canada focuses on partnerships that bring stability and predictability by leaning into critical minerals and strengthening ties with Germany and the wider EU. Carney showed that Canada is not simply reacting to Washington's pressure, it is setting its own course. This strategy also gives Canada more influence in its dealings with the United States. Trump may dominate headlines with new tariff threats, but Canada controls assets that Washington and its allies cannot ignore. Copper, lithium, and rare earth magnets are at the heart of the next-generation economy, and Canada is turning them into instruments of national strength. In this round of trade confrontation, Ottawa did more than withstand pressure. It shifted the board entirely. The message is clear. Trump can raise tariffs, but Canada now holds something more valuable: the trust of partners and the resources to power the future.